Hi class, today's lecture is on economic growth, and there's three big keys that I want you to get from today's little mini talk here. First off, I want you to be clear on what economic growth is. Secondly, we're going to look at how one would go about calculating an economic growth rate so that you can put a number on just how much growth you're seeing in a given time period. And then third, we're going to talk about policies or institutions that typically lead to economic growth. All right, so to start off with, in terms of thinking about what economic growth actually is, most basically, this is just an improvement in a country's ability to produce in some way. And there's two ways that you could see evidence for that, and they're listed up here on top on the board here. One way that you could find evidence for economic growth is if you see that real GDP in a given country is increasing. Right? That's sufficient to demonstrate economic growth. Another way, though, that you could see economic growth is if there's an improvement or an increase in real per capita GDP, where the difference between the two is that per capita GDP is just taking that overall level of GDP and dividing it by the population. So this is showing you GDP per person. This is showing you the overall amount of production in the economy. So both of these are useful in terms of why you'd want to look at one or the other. Real GDP or overall production, that's going to give you a better idea of a country's role in the world economy. Right? So those countries that have the highest real GDP in the world are the countries with the biggest economies, things like the United States, China, and Japan. These are countries that have a great deal of influence over the world economy. Real per capita GDP, on the other hand, these are going to show you those countries that typically have the highest standard of living, the wealthiest countries on earth. So the United States shows up on this list as well as being up near the tip top, but also many smaller countries that have small economies in an aggregate sense, but on a per person basis have quite high standard of living. So think of the countries like Switzerland or Monaco or something like that, where they're very wealthy, but they're very, very small countries. All right, so both of these are useful. An increase in either one of them is enough to conclude that you're observing economic growth. All right. Another goal that we have here for today is to be able to say something about how much growth occurs in a given economy. And to do that, you'd calculate a growth rate. The formula that you want to use here, guys, is this one listed on the board here, where this is an application with that initial value method that we actually use throughout the term. And the basic way that this will work is to, in the numerator, take the difference between your two data points. So I have it listed here as GDP2 minus GDP1, so the difference between the two, and then divide that here in the denominator by whatever you started with, GDP1. And then to express this as a percentage, which we typically do with growth rates, you're going to want to multiply the whole thing by 100. All right, so we've got some numbers here that we can use really quickly just to see how this works. This is a snap. So let's say that GDP increased from one year to the next, from 800,000 up to 900,000, and you wanted to know just how much economic growth did that country get across those 2 years. So as I said, all you're going to want to do is apply this formula. Take 900,000 GDP in the second year, and subtract from that whatever GDP was in the first year, which is 800,000, divide it by whatever you started with. GDP in the first year was 800,000. And then lastly, multiply this by 100. Right? So you would say that from year 1 to 2, this economy experienced a growth rate of 12.5%. So not much to that. All right. The last thing that we want to do here is to consider the sort of policies that correlate with economic growth so that we can better understand what governments ought to be doing if they want to put themselves on a path to achieving that growth. And of course, these aren't policies that are necessarily going to lead to economic growth. Folks haven't figured this out in a formulaic way or anything like that. It's just that these things here typically go along with economic growth. All right, so what are we looking for? First up, you want to have strong property rights. And this is to say that the government in question is enforcing property rights, right? Enforcing patents and copyrights and things like this. The reason for that is because we want to give people incentive to be innovative and to develop new products. And if folks are not confident that their property rights will be respected, then of course they don't have as much incentive to engage in those positive behaviors. So strong property rights correlate with growth. Another thing that we look for is widespread education, right? And I think this makes some sense, right? Countries that have better educated workforces typically have more productive workforces. And so if you can make folks more productive in a given country, that goes along with economic growth. Next up here, we have international trade, free international trade. And so the idea here is that countries want to limit any of those barriers to international trade that actually we'll get to in chapter 38 in a few days. So these are things like tariffs and quotas and things like that. By encouraging international trade, you can have a country be more efficient in terms of what they're producing, and that goes along with economic growth. Next up, we want to see efficient financial institutions. And this is the idea that we want to have a well-functioning banking system, most basically, in the economy. So this is so that people who have good ideas for new businesses can get those ideas funded. Right? So if there's a well-functioning financial system, it's not the case that you need to have a good idea for a new company and at the same time money to get that started. Instead, if you've got a good idea but you don't have the money, there's channels that you can go through to acquire funding. And so that's a good thing. Efficient financial institutions therefore correlate with growth. And then finally, big theme of the class, of any econ class that you'll take, is that markets typically do a good job of allocating resources, right? So the use of markets as opposed to command and control type of systems oftentimes correlates with economic growth, right? So there you have it. That's a quick description of what economic growth is, how you'd go about calculating a growth rate, and then lastly, these growth promoting institutions.